Hi. So this is just a short video to talk you through some of the expectations of the Voyages description project, and just make sure that that everything's clear and that you're ready to do that project. So the first thing that we need to talk about is z-scores. Now we've talked about z-scores before in the context of the normal distribution, but I want to make sure that they're clear in this context. And what we're going to use z-scores for here is as a measure of relative position. So z-scores are a way to measure the number of standard deviations above or below the mean an observation lies. So a z-score of 1 means that the observation is 1 standard deviation above the mean. A z-score of -1 means that the observation is 1 standard deviation below the mean. Those are just for example. Z-scores can be any number from negative infinity to positive infinity, but as we saw with the normal distribution, most of the time they're within -3 to 3. And what we're really looking for here is what is the value, what is the z-score, and what does that tell us about the number that we're looking at the z-score of? Especially, where is it compared to the mean? If it's a positive z-score, that means it's above the mean. If it's a negative z-score, it's going to be below the mean. A z-score of exactly 0 is going to be exactly the mean. So there's negative, positive, 0, but then there's also the value of it. We saw with when we looked at the normal distribution, about 68% of the time you're going to get a z-score between -1 and 1, assuming a normal distribution. But so it would be somewhat unusual to get a z-score outside of that. About 95% of the time we're going to get a z-score between -2 and 2. So any z-scores that are less than -2 or greater than 2 are going to be a little bit unusual. Now, if you look at the standard normal distribution, about 99.7% of the time, and you can verify this using StatCrunch if you want to, about 99.7% of the time, you're going to get a z-score between -3 and 3. So as you're doing this project, if you calculate a z-score for the Ogden, that's the ship that we're looking for. We're trying to compare to some of the other voyages. If you come up with a z-score of -4, for one thing, it might mean you've made a mistake, but let's assume you didn't make a mistake. That would mean that it's very, very atypical compared to other voyages in your data set. On the other hand, if you get a z-score of 0.5, that means it's just a little bit above average. Okay? So to show you how to calculate a z-score, let's look at an example. Let's suppose a high school student took the ACT and the SAT, and on the ACT they scored a 26. On the SAT, on a 2400 point scale, they got an 1850. So the z-score, to answer that question, which of the two scores they should send to the colleges, we're going to calculate the z-score just like we did before. X minus the mean divided by the standard deviation. And the mean and standard deviation could be for the sample or the population. As long as you subtract the mean and divide by the standard deviation, you're fine. So in this example, suppose we knew that the mean SAT score was 1500 and that the standard deviation was 300. That student's SAT score was 1850, so we'd subtract the mean of 1500, divide by the standard deviation of 300, and we'd find out then that the student scored 1.6667 standard deviations above the mean. That's fairly high, but not so unusual that it would be unbelievable. On the ACT, if we assume the mean ACT score is 21 and the standard deviation is 4.7, the student scored 26, So we'd subtract the mean, divide by the standard deviation, and we'd get that the student scored a little over 1 standard deviation above the mean. So in comparison, that tells you that the student's score on the SAT was higher, so that'd be the one he should send. Now on your project, you're not going to compare the two scores like this, but we just kind of want to know where the Ogden is, because we're looking to characterize that one ship and put it in context. We want to see where it is. So that's z-scores. Now let's look at your data. So I'm looking at the full data set here, and you won't be working with the full data set because you're going to limit yours, but I have here all 36,000 almost observations. And keep in mind that if you're using the student version, you're going to have to shrink it down to no more than 1,500 observations. And with the student version, you're only allowed to have 50 variables, but you're not going to have that problem. The first thing I want to point out to you is that these variables are not easy to read and decipher. So please, please, please put labels on here so that in your SPSS output, it's easy to determine what we're looking at. Okay, ADLT1IMP is not very easy to figure out, but number of adults at first port of purchase, that makes sense. So please put labels in. Okay, so the next thing you're going to do once you've got your data set is you're going to pick 2 qualitative variables from that list on the assignment. And once you pick one of those, you're going to go to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, Frequencies. And I've picked one of these variables. And let's see. So if I go down here and find it again, it's DEPT region IMP1. So we're just going to take the variable we're interested in, move it over. We would like to see a bar chart. That'd be nice. And let's look at the percentages on it. So click Continue and click OK. And so it gives us the frequency table and it gives us the bar chart. What we want to know here is in which one of these categories was the Ogden? Was it in one of the typical categories or was it in an unusual category? So if it's in a category that was 14 of them out of 36,000, one that's so small it rounds to 0, that's going to be atypical. But if it's in, a category that that's 26.6%, just for example, of all the voyages came from a particular place, then that's not going to be atypical. That's going to be fairly normal. So that's the qualitative variables. And you're going to do 2 of those. Now let's look at what you're going to do with the quantitative variables. So go to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and then go to Explore. Now you can make this window bigger to make it easier to deal with. And let's just pick one of the variables on the list. Crew at voyage outset is one of the variables. Before we click anything else here, let's go to plots because I want to see the histogram, but we don't need the stem and leaf plot. So under plots, put a check next to histogram and we can uncheck stem and leaf because we don't need that. So click Continue, click OK. And we have here our descriptive statistics. So you're going to state the mean, median, standard deviation, minimum, maximum, range. We didn't really talk about any of the other things, at least not yet. So you don't have to state those, but but try to put that into context a little bit. this tells me that on average there were about 30 crew people starting out on the voyage. And the standard deviation is 15. So that's a very large standard deviation in comparison to the mean, actually. But we've got a histogram. And the histogram is going to, so I want you to talk about the shape of the histogram. Is it bell shape? Is it skewed to the left? Is it skewed to the right? And what does that tell you about the data? Most of the observations are between this value and this value. But there were a few that exceeded some value over here. I don't want to say what they are because I don't want to give away anything. But finally, here we've got the box plot. And you can go back and look at what the box plot tells us. One thing that's really important in the box plot is to look at the outliers. This one here, this box plot, or this outlier here, has about 600 crew on board. That's far enough away from the rest of the observations that I actually am a little suspicious that it might be a mistake. But that's what we get from that. Now, so that's the description part. Now let's talk about where is the Ogden in comparison to this. You're going to go look at your data and find the Ogden in the data set. And I'm not going to do that for you, but you're going to find it. And you're going to take the value for that variable. So crew at voyage outset, find it for the Ogden, and then find the z-score. So subtract the mean and divide by the standard deviation that come out of this output. And then interpret that the same way that I just showed you how. All right. So looking forward to getting some good responses on this one. I'm around, and Professor Bailey's around, so please let us know if you have any questions or concerns. All right, that's it.